Welcome back to Italian opera in the 19th century. We left off the first lecture discussing the new interest in tragic personal stories. This signals a dramatic shift over the course of the middle of the 19th century in styles of singing as well, from the bel canto style, the highly stylized and highly conventional style, toward a more dramatically realistic style and style of singing known as Verismo. Verismo is translated as realism, and there was an important movement of realism developing in France on literature and in painting in the middle of the 19th century, and the opera Carmen is a perfect example from 1875 of the realist movement in France. And the qualities of that realism is shared by Italian Verismo. In the a little bit later in the 1890s is the heyday of Verismo. But if anything, the Italians exaggerate these features. So the characters are, rather than noblemen, they're common characters. But unlike the opera buffa common characters of the 18th century, these are serious operas, tragic. So the emotions are raw and extreme. These operas almost always end in murder, usually over infidelity. So you can see it in conversation with Italian opera buffa in terms of the characters and the general subject matter, infidelity. But the emotions are much more real. They're not just it's not just a joke anymore. They're playing for keeps, these characters. The two most important composers of Italian Verismo are Mascagni and Leoncavallo. Mascagni's Cavalleria Rusticana and Leoncavallo's I Pagliacci are both fairly short operas, really just one act. Or if they're, I think they're two acts each, but they're short acts. So they make a nice pairing on an evening of opera, known as shorthand cav pag. Another development you see, also influenced by developments in France, is exoticism. Puccini's Madame Butterfly and Turandot are perfect examples of this. Exoticism is developed in France. The operas associated with it are Bizet's Pearl Fishers and Dalit's Lakme. Both of those are set in South Asia, in India. Puccini's Madame Butterfly is set in Japan. Turandot is set in sort of a mythical China. Exoticism was an important movement in painting as well. It's basically the charm of the unfamiliar, or this kind of interest, titillation really, in foreign cultures. And it's essentially a fantasy. These stories are not based in any way on the actual practices or actual stories, or what happens to people in other cultures. This is really a European fantasy of an exotic other. And as such, though, it's important because it shapes the way Europeans see themselves by projecting these qualities onto people from other cultures. It also, in a kind of a darker sense, coincides with the imperialist movement of the late 19th and early 20th century, which was dominated world affairs and ultimately culminates in the two world wars. So exoticism is more than just a pleasant diversion to other cultures. It's really touching on important ways that Western Europeans see people in other parts of the world and how they see themselves. Puccini, of course, is the composer who inherits Verdi's mantle as the great Italian composer. His his operas, just as Verdi's and Rossini's had spread throughout Europe, Puccini's popularity spread throughout the world, particularly in the United States. And here we see America, for the first time, becoming a really important player. The Metropolitan Opera is founded in 1883. Around the turn of the century, it takes a real turn toward almost exclusively Italian opera. They commissioned Puccini, and particularly his Il Tridico was very popular and still is popular to this day. So America is starting to become a player in the world of opera as we now know it is today. Now the period comes to an end without a doubt with Puccini's death. 1824, his last opera, Turandot, is premiered in 1826 posthumously. He'd never finished it, someone else had to finish it for him. I can't help but see the connection between Puccini's death in 1824 and the rise to power of the fascist dictator Mussolini in 1824. So much is going on in the 20th century. We'll talk about this over the rest of the course, why opera changes so dramatically. Some say it dies, really, with the death of Puccini around this time. Without a question, that opera ceases to be a living popular tradition after the death of Puccini. And by that I mean opera ceases to basically be a money-making venture. There's a lot of reasons for this. It's not just that Puccini died. There's a reason why no one came after Puccini to sort of take his place. One argument is that the people that would, the successors to Puccini made films. They didn't write operas. Film displaces opera as a popular mass cultural entertainment. And for obvious reasons, it's much cheaper. Opera is very expensive to produce, and you have to do it live. Film is expensive to produce, but you can mass produce it. So you can make much more money, and you can sell it cheaply. So in some ways, this kills opera. But there are other things that have changed dramatically, and that's for something for us to explore as we continue on through the course. So that's Italian opera, the Golden Age, from Rossini through to the death of Puccini.